Welcome to Wrestling with Heart, a podcast looking at pro wrestlers giving back to their community. Join me, Stanley Carr, as I interview wrestling's hottest names who use their platforms as entertainers to raise awareness and do community service. Hello and welcome to another edition of Wrestling with Heart. This is the show where we talk with professional wrestlers and professional wrestling personalities about their lives in and outside of the ring, as well as doing acts of charity work, community service, volunteering, and spreading positivity. We're always about the positive vibes here on the show, and with me right now, I've got a very special guest. He has worked for the WWE and WCW. I'm pleased to welcome the one and only Maxx Payne. Welcome to Wrestling with Heart.
My pleasure.
All right.
Nice to see you, Stanley.
Absolutely. So tell me about your childhood and upbringing. Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in a little town called Pleasant Grove, Utah. It's about 45 minutes south of Salt Lake City. I affectionately call it deep behind the Zion Curtain. I grew up in a predominantly LDS community, and I spent the first 16, 17 years of my life there.
Okay. All right. Now, was wrestling always something you enjoyed watching as a kid? Was that something you fell into later?
It's funny. My mother would hire a lot of different babysitters for me when I was a kid. So I had a lot of female babysitters, and I was a hellion. I was an active kid, and I think some of the female babysitters, looking back in retrospect, probably told my mom, the money you're paying me is not worth it because he's a nightmare. So she started hiring some young men to come and babysit. And she hired, I had a piano teacher when I was very young, and it was, there was a prominent family in my hometown called the Jenkins family. The father was a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And then the mother taught piano lessons. And then they had two older boys, Bruce and Brett Jenkins. And the first time she hired Bruce, and I had a great time with him, but then she hired Brett. And Brett was this huge wrestling fan. And one of the ways he'd get me to behave is he'd say, okay, if you're really good, if you're really cool tonight, then we'll stay up and you can watch professional wrestling. And it's so amazing. He'd make all these sound effects, and it's Rocky Mountain Wrestling. You're going to love it. And I'm like, yay, okay, professional wrestling. And I can distinctly remember that I think one time, because it was on like 10:30. And I think I made it one time to where I opened my eyes and went, oh, wow, that's what professional wrestling is. So, I always had this image of wrestling when I was a kid. And then as I got older and, kind of fell away from it, and I wasn't into it that much. And then I became incredibly interested in, as I got into late grade school and junior high school and high school, I started to be into amateur wrestling. And I spent a lot of my, I started out in a little kids program. I did it like in second or third grade. We had a new wrestling coach at our high school. And one of the things he wanted to do was introduce a little kids wrestling program to the city so that, he could start the tradition of kids being really young when they started amateur wrestling. And I went to the young kids program, and I hated it, and then I decided I was going to play football. And very early on, the football coach in our hometown said, hey, Pete, you gonna play football? I said, yep. He says, you gonna wrestle? I said, nope. He said, well, then you're not gonna play football if you're not gonna wrestle. And I'm like, well, I want to play football bad enough. Okay, I'll wrestle. And prophetically, I ended up wrestling all through high school and not playing football. It was an interesting turn of events, but eventually I ended up being an amateur wrestler and not a football player. And then because I was an amateur wrestler, there's a stigma attached to being an amateur wrestler. And then people would, because I was big, and they'd ask me, so what do you do? You're big. Did you play football? No, I'm a wrestler. Oh, wrestling. I watch that on TV all the time. And I said, I would always be defensive and say, you don't watch what I do. I do the kind of wrestling nobody watches except, parents who go to watch their kids wrestle at a high school wrestling match. And it always kind of offended me. And eventually I ran into professional wrestling. But that's how I got my start in professional wrestling. And I have a couple other stories. I had a nephew that took me to a wrestling match with Hulk Hogan. And he tried to talk me into jumping in the ring. I wouldn't do it. And, I was kind of around wrestling a lot in my younger years, but I never really got into it really heavy until I actually joined the professional wrestling ranks.
What was the moment for you where you decided, I want to give pro wrestling a shot? I got nothing to lose here. I'm going to go for it.
So I was in. I graduated from college with a degree in television and film, and I had somebody that was really important in my life who gave me some pretty serious advice. He said, if you want a career in television and film, you've got to move to Los Angeles to pursue that. And so I did when I graduated from college in 1985. And one of the first jobs I had when I went to Los Angeles was working as a security guard. And one of the events I worked at a boxing match, Tate, Tillman, and Gonzalez. And this boxer, this Tate, it was right after the '84 Olympics, and it was his debut as a pro fighter. And I worked the boxing match, and it was at the Palladium on Sunset Strip in downtown LA, on Sunset Strip. And that particular day, I had three major events happen. The first one was I met a guy who I'd met because I'd gone to Iowa State University as a wrestler. I met this guy who was an independent cameraman in television and film production. And I met him at the Palladium in the middle of this boxing match because he was running handheld camera for ABC, and he almost tripped, and I caught him before he fell backwards, and he turned around, and I knew the guy. He gave me his business card. That ended up getting me a job in working as an independent videographer in Los Angeles. And then the guy who owned the security company I worked for came, and I'd never met him before in my life. He was from right next to my hometown was another town called Lehi, Utah. And he was from Lehi. He'd heard about me, and he knew who I was. He'd followed my career because when I was younger, I was in a motion picture. He'd followed my career, so he knew who I was. He came and got me, said, "Hey, you don't know me, but I know you. Have you ever thought about being a professional wrestler? Because if you have, I want to introduce you to somebody." And at that moment in time, he introduced me to Red Bastien. And from that moment forward, once I met Red, that's when my career started. Red Bastien had already trained the Ultimate Warrior and Sting, the actual session before I trained. Red had trained those two guys, and a couple of other guys that didn't rise as high, obviously, as those two guys did. And then I ran into Farrah Fawcett and Ryan O'Neal. So it was a big day as a security guard at the Palladium, and that was the day that I ran into professional wrestling. But truly, the day that changed my life in professional wrestling was the day I built the cage for King Kong Bundy and Hulk Hogan in WrestleMania 2, and I heard the amazing roar of the crowd and the pop that Hogan got when he won in WrestleMania 2. And from that moment forward, I knew that's what I wanted to do.
That's a huge deal, building that structure. I mean, talk about such a legendary moment, being there for that. What was it like, getting the chance to be at such an iconic event like a WrestleMania, working alongside two of the greats of the industry?
Oh, it was amazing. You're absolutely right. It was, that's why, I just, every time I've told that story, countless times. And every time I tell that story, um, I relive it. I mean, I can literally smell the Los Angeles sports arena. And I was so lucky to have been there. And, when you're, in a stadium of, 20,000 people, 20,000 people, and you hear that crowd explode that way. And I was standing right next to the cage on the floor because I was responsible for the cage that day. So I had, backstage pass, and I was standing there taking care of the cage, making sure everything was going well. I was literally standing there looking up when Hogan, won the match, got the big pop, and you feel the energy of a crowd, and you feel the energy of what it feels like to stand in front of that many people and feel the energy that they're giving to you. I just knew that's what I wanted to do the rest of my life.
Now, you got trained under Red Bastien. I'd imagine, transitioning from amateur wrestling to professional wrestling, uh, there's some differences, I'd imagine for sure, but it's hard. You really have to put your body through so much and sacrifice a lot. Talk to me about your story. What was it like learning how to wrestle?
You know, Amateur wrestling, as much as I loved amateur wrestling, and I trained for amateur wrestling. It doesn't prepare you for professional wrestling. Professional wrestling is a completely different mindset. It's a completely different game. The two have very little in common, and yet professional wrestling has a great deal of respect for those who were in the amateur wrestling world, and they actually love it. Most promoters love it when an amateur wrestler comes into the professional wrestling ranks because it adds legitimacy. Because amateur wrestling has a different kind of appeal. It's not considered, especially back then, the word fake was thrown around a lot. But I will tell you, man, when I first started training as a professional wrestler, I was not prepared for how difficult being a pro wrestler was. It, it was, when you start learning how to just something as simple that professionals make look so easy of just hitting the ropes, running and running into the ropes. It took me 2 weeks to get over the pain. I had bruises all the way up and down my rib cage from where I was hitting those ropes and building up the scar tissue to get used to that. And so, and then learning to fall down and not get hurt. That's a difficult process because that's the only way you learn how to fall down and fall down correctly is by doing it. And you make those mistakes in the beginning, but you learn very quickly how to fall flat because if you don't, the soreness and the pain level is carried on that much longer every time you get in the ring. So the transition was, I thought I was a tough son of a bitch, but I'll tell you what, when I started learning how to be a pro wrestler, it was a whole different world.
Yeah, and so you put together, the fundamentals and get your reps in. You make your debut. Talk to me about your first few matches in the business. Were you nervous? Were you scared? Were you confident? Talk to me about those first few matches you had upon your time learning how to wrestle and training.
So I broke into the business in a very, very unique way. Not very many people. In fact, I only know really three other guys that broke into the business the way I do, and actually only two of them actually broke in the way I did. I broke in the professional wrestling business in the New Japan Pro Wrestling dojo. Um, After I wrestled with Red got me booked in Japan. The Japanese were looking for a big amateur wrestler that they could put a gimmick on, and I happened to be the guy that went to their dojo. I lived in the dojo with my roommate at the time was Chris Benoit, and then later on my roommate was Brian Adams of Demolition fame, and so I broke in Japan, and my debut match. I just was thinking about this when you said that. My debut wrestling match was in the Tokyo Sumo Palace in front of 22,000 people.
Wow.
So, yeah, to say the least. And I look back at it now, and it's like, oh my God, it's so embarrassing. I watch it to this day. It makes me cringe because I thought I knew everything. I didn't know shit. But it was an amazing, amazing moment, and I look back at it with nothing but love and respect. And the guy I broke in with was a guy named the Barbarian. He wrestled all over American territories as the Barbarian, and I was really really lucky. And that was my debut match in the professional wrestling business.
What a
22,000 in the Sumo Wrestling Palace in Tokyo.
what a heck of a way to make an impact. I mean, you're talking about
Yeah.
a crowd that is very passionate about the industry and
Yes.
such a rich culture and tradition. Um, Talk to me about like the differences because now you wrestle in Japan and then you work in America, of course, work for WCW as
Mm-hmm.
Maxx Payne. It's a night and day difference because you're talking about two different audiences.
Yeah, and I actually after my Japan time, I spent a year in Jerry Lawler's territory in the Mid South Coliseum
Memphis.
in the CWA in Memphis. And then when I left there, I started my own little territory in Utah called the WWA, and, and I was fortunate enough to work with Jimmy Snuka and Colonel De Beers. Jimmy Snuka was from Utah and lived in the same hometown I was from, a town called Orem, Utah. We met coincidentally, and we ended up running a whole bunch of shows together. And a guy named Colonel De Beers, and then there were a bunch of guys that would come from Los Angeles, Billy Anderson and Louis Spicoli, Louis Muccioli, who ended up being Rad Radford. So I did my own little territory. And then I went to another territory called the CWA, but this one was called the Catch Wrestling Alliance. And that was in Germany with Otto Vons. And I was there for 2 years before I actually went to the CWA. So I was lucky. I ended up, getting, a lot of American experience working in those smaller territories, which coincidentally were the small territories by then were virtually dead because of what Vince McMahon had done. Vince had, bought up all the territories and taken all the small territories away, and the training grounds were going away at breakneck speed. And so I was very fortunate to get a gig in Germany. And like I said, I was there for 2 seasons. They run in seasons in Germany. So I went to their back to back years. And that's where I actually developed the Maxx Payne character that I ended up bringing to the WCW when I talked to Bill Watts and I got my job with the WCW. So, yeah, I worked in a couple of territories that were completely different than the way America wrestles. The Japanese and the Europeans, both of them have distinctly different styles. And I was very fortunate to learn those styles before I came to America and went into the WCW.
Now, as you're getting your experience and learning how to work in the ring, You're working with several different trainers and mentors. What kinds of advice are you getting from them that later on in life you recall and propelled you to uh, do the things that you're doing outside of wrestling? Pieces of advice that you've taken away from your time in the ring that you've applied to today.
One of my favorite pieces of advice was I met a guy in Japan by the name of Bill Eadie. He was Axe in Demolition. And Bill, gave me a piece of advice once that I've carried with me my whole life in many of situations. He said, there comes a time in your life, Max, that uh, you need to say no. And if you don't say no when you need to say no, the only person you got to blame is the man in the mirror. And those words ended up being very profound in my career, and words that whenever I defied them, they cost me greatly.
Yeah, I mean, you got to take care of yourself, do what's best for you.
Right,
And and
right. Especially in the wrestling business, because nobody else is going to do it for you.
you have to really think about what you're doing and making sure that you're making the decisions that are right for you at the moment. So,
Yeah.
uh, getting into that now, had a run in WCW as Maxx Payne, and then you had a run in the WWE as Man Mountain Rock, and that's a very interesting character. Talk to me about that, how that whole deal came about.
Man Mountain Rock is a bit of a dichotomy for me because um, it was a very difficult time in my career. And quite honestly, like we just talked about, um, that character didn't fit my character very well as a person and who I wanted to be as a wrestling character. But I was in the WWF, and at the time, because if you feel like you know, if Vince asks you to do it, then maybe you ought to put your best foot forward and try to do that. Unfortunately, there were a lot of behind the scenes things going on that were very debilitating about the Man Mountain Rock character that made it a very difficult character for me to play because I not only was I being deprived of who I really thought my character was, I was being deprived of my musical aspirations at the time. And so the Man Mountain Rock character for me is a very difficult time in my career because they wanted to tell me how to do it, and yet I was the guy doing it, and it was that's a difficult thing to pull off, and because I never felt like a very good puppet. I'd worked really hard on developing the Maxx Payne character. That was a dark character that was much more along the lines of Alice Cooper and Kiss and Black Sabbath, the bands that I'd grown up with, and the styles of music that I wanted to emulate and play. And so as a result of that, the Man Mountain Rock character didn't fit my persona very well because it was tie-dyed and it was a more of a 60s rock kind of guy, and I wasn't a 60s rock guy, man. I was a 70s rock guy. I was like I said, a Black Sabbath guy, an Alice Cooper guy, a David Bowie guy, a T-Rex guy, you know, and a Kiss guy, and so the Man Mountain Rock character was a very, very difficult character for me to play. And quite frankly, like I said to you earlier, there were several occasions with the Man Mountain Rock character I wished I would have said no, because it would have empowered me in a way that would have given me some of the control back of my character and maybe given me some more longevity by allowing that character to come out. I experimented with a couple other characters in the WWF, and at the time it didn't work. We didn't make it happen. And the WWF at the time really wanted to own everything about the character I was doing, and I don't feel like they thought they could own the Maxx Payne character, and so as a result of that, they killed that character, and that was a very difficult time for me, and so I have some fond memories of it because I did I did a couple of things that I'm very proud of and that are going to manifest themselves in the future. As you know, like coming up, I still have some things I did as the Man Mountain Rock character that haven't been released yet, and I'm very proud of, and they're going to be coming out in the next 6 months to a year. But until that comes out, you won't actually get to see the frustrations that I was feeling, because believe it or not, I actually captured that frustration on a video camera. And in the not too distant future, you're going to get a really deep look inside the Man Mountain Rock character and the frustration I was feeling.
Wow. I mean, it's almost like, you want to play a character that you feel you're more comfortable with. And so the Maxx Payne character felt it spoke to you as to how you felt about where you felt your character should be heading. Now, what was it about the Maxx Payne character that meant a lot to you?
Well, I created it from ground up. From the beginning of my wrestling career, I went into the wrestling business because of the idea of being able to create my own character. And so when I created the Maxx Payne character, I created that character that I felt like I could live with the rest of my life. And that was part of the beauty of that character for me. It made it easy to play because it was something that I developed. I believe when you look at the greats, The Rock, Stone Cold, Taker, the list goes on. Those guys who were very successful in their characters, they played those characters because those were characters that they had developed. Those were characters that they believed in, and those were characters that they had genuinely put their heart and soul into. And that's essential and critical in the wrestling business, because how can I ask you to believe in me if I don't believe in that character that I'm developing? And so that was where the frustration came.
And you got to work a lot of different people over the course of your career, step into the ring with so many different opponents. Who were some of your favorite wrestlers that you got to compete against over the years?
I've been so lucky, man. That's a big list, and I always am afraid to talk about that because in fear of, I don't want to offend somebody that I would miss. A lot of my favorite wrestling matches and the people I worked with, that I have some of the strongest memories of. One of my favorite people is a guy named Dave Finley, or Fit Finley.
Mm-hmm.
He was a godsend to me. He taught me so much about the wrestling business. Darren Matthews, Lord Steven Regal, he taught me a ton about the wrestling business. Rip Rogers, Tony St. Clair, Dave Taylor. All these guys are guys that I worked with on a daily basis in Germany. And Germany's such a different beast. You work with the same people over and over and over again with every night. And then in the States, I got to work with Vader. I got to work with Ricky Steamboat. I worked with Bob Backlund. I worked with Louis Muccioli, Rad Radford, and the list goes on. And like I said, Johnny B. Bad, all of those characters and all those wrestlers, I have nothing but fond things to say about him. Tom Zank, he was my first match in the WCW. I was really lucky. I got to work with some fine individuals. I worked with Chris Benoit a number of times in Europe, and just was really, really lucky to be able to work with some of the folks I got to work with.
And I believe you got to work with Mick Foley as well. Cactus Jack.
Oh, of course. See, that's what I mean. Yeah, he and I were tag team partners. I actually wrestled against him a couple of times when I was a heel. But then we ended up tagging together. And of course, my relationship with Mick is one of my fondest memories in the wrestling business. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's gotta feel good, when you keep in touch with all these people and you run into them. There's no better feeling in the world because it's like not a day goes by. It's like old times when you see
Right.
people. Yeah.
Right.
Now, I think this is pretty interesting. You had shared a story with me off air about some of the stuff that you had been able to do years ago with your family, volunteering in your community. Talk to me about that experience and what was that experience like for you?
My mother was the chief attendant of the geriatric ward at the Utah State Mental Hospital. And so I worked with a lot of elderly, disabled folks from the time I was old enough to remember. Uh, and I used to say to people all the time that I was born and raised in a mental hospital because I literally was. My mother, I was kind of a I was kind of an only child. And when I say that, the reason I say that is because I came along so late in my mother and father's married life that when they had me, my next oldest brother to me when I was born was 12 years old. And by the time I was 5 years old, he moved out of the house. And so I basically grew up in a two-parent household alone because all my brothers were married and moved out and had their own families. In fact, my oldest brother was married and had two children older than me. I have a nephew that's 5 years older than me and a niece that's 3 years older than me. And so my mother, especially in the summertime, because I was an energetic kid, my mother in the summertime, because she didn't want to pay for a babysitter and she didn't want to leave me alone from the time I was 5 years old, a lot of times the hospital was okay with her bringing me to work. So she would bring me to work. And from a very early age, I just watched the lead of my mother and the compassion of my mother and how she treated these older folks. And I grew up understanding, a lot of these people were throwaway people, people who were mentally ill, people who'd had massive strokes, people who'd had lobotomies, people who had been through, were manic depressives during an era when the chemical control didn't exist yet. And so these people were condemned and locked into this institution. And my mother was a very, very empathetic, compassionate woman who taught me from the time I started living with her on the Utah State Mental Hospital ward how to treat these folks with respect and dignity and love them for what they brought to the table. Because my mother she was one of those people that taught me from the time I was old enough to remember that if you look for the good in people, you will find it. Everyone has good in them. And she taught me that at a very early age. And some of the people that, I grew up around, the average person would look at them and go, wow, how can you see any good at that? They'd be terrified of them. And I wasn't terrified of them because my mother made me feel and taught me how to be comfortable in front of them. And usually the way you did that was by being kind. And so I grew up with a plethora of experiences that the average person could never even begin to imagine. And so my servitude, like I said, was involuntary, yet was completely voluntary because once I learned how precious it was to give to these people and how much they loved the vigor of youth. They loved my mother for what my mother brought to the table. And because I was my mother's, they loved me. And so I treated them with the same kind of respect that my mother treated them with. And as a result of that, I had great relationships with these folks. And I have nothing but fond memories of growing up in this ward with my mother.
That's so powerful, seeing these people, that are going through so much in their lives, and you're there visiting them, talking with them, trying to assure them, that they'll get through this in one way or another. Um,
Yeah.
that's really just
Knowing they were never leaving. That all of them knew they were never leaving the state hospital, and that there was no respite for them. There was no light at the end of the tunnel for them. They were there. Everyone that I met and knew through my mother, none of them ever left the senior unit of the hospital. They all died on the ward at the hospital.
Wow, that's horrifying to hear. It's and you're able to talk to these people, uh, you know, be there for them in time of need. Was there a moment for you when you're around these people? Any memories of being around uh, some of these people that you were with that you can recall was just such a just such a a power, like a tear jerker.
Yeah, I have to say that that's an easy one for me because my on all the major holidays, um, they would fill a van with the most, not always the most able-bodied either. Sometimes they would bring folks who had had strokes that were completely paralyzed to my mom's house in wheelchairs, and they would pull up in front of our house with 5 or 6 of these patients, and my mother would spend 2 days at Thanksgiving and 2 days at Christmas time preparing food, and she would invite them into our home, and they would come to our home and spend Thanksgiving with us. They'd spend Christmas with us. They'd spend New Year's Eve with us. And my mother had created this band. My mother played the piano by ear and could sing and play anything. And so they would come to our house, and she would feed them. And, they didn't get that kind of food at the state hospital. So they would come to our house and they would eat and have a great time eating. And then they would go sit in our living room, and my mother would sit down at the piano and play. She knew all these old songs, these old classic songs that they all knew and loved to play. And she created this band with all these noisemakers and musical instruments, a kazoo and a washboard, tambourine and shakers, and this room full of elderly, psycho controlled, institutionally determined. I mean, these folks, like I said, were institutionally bound for life, would sit around our living room and sing Christmas songs and play these musical instruments, and their bellies were full. And, the 1, 2, 3 times a year that they really got to feel what it felt like to go be in a home, to be at home for, you know, the only time they ever got, because their families certainly never did that for them. If my mother hadn't have done that for them, and when she quit doing it for them, it never happened again. And so, though I remember as a kid sitting in the kitchen and watching my mom play and passing out all these instruments to these folks, and they would sit there for hours, and my mom would play Christmas songs for an hour, and play these songs that were hits that they had listened to on the AM radio when they were young people, and she would sing them and they would all play together. And I just remember the sheer joy in their faces and the body language that was so pervasive throughout the room, because for the first time since probably they had been admitted to the hospital, they felt like they were home for a minute.
Playing music and eating food, that sounds like a great time. Who can ask for anything better, over the holidays than by doing that?
Yeah, and it was pure joy. And then of course she bought presents for all of them, and they all got to open presents, and so it was beautiful. It was really just a beautiful, beautiful moment.
What is it about giving back to the community that gives you the most joy?
You know, I remember this one Christmas. Speaking of Christmases, um, my mother and father were, just incredibly giving to me. And being an only child, there were very few Christmases. In fact, I can't remember one that I didn't get everything I ever wanted. You I was, I really believed in Santa Claus because, man, he was good to me. I did not go without. I had motorcycles and bicycles and cars, and I just had. I was given everything. My parents were so generous, loving and caring, and I was in that real selfish adolescent age one Christmas, and I tore through all my presents in about 5 minutes, and I don't know what I thought I was. I mean, I don't think there wasn't something specific I didn't get, but I looked at my mother and father and I said, "Wow, is this all I got for Christmas this year?" And they both laughed because I literally had this pile of you know gifts that was just unbelievable. A stereo center, records, and everything I wanted. And I remember my mother saying to me that I think it was that time where she knew it was time for me to grow up. And God bless her for saying this to me. I mean, I was very lucky that my mother was, and she did it so well. There was no anger in her voice. She said to me, she said, son, I think you're going to find out as you travel through life that the great joy of life is not what you get. It's not, people giving you stuff. I think you're going to find out that the great joy of life comes from, the giving. It's what you give back to the world that makes you feel good. And at the time when you're 12 years old, you're like, yeah, shut up, old man and old woman. Where's the rest of my presents, And I'm telling you this story, and they both have been dead now for 25 years. And that tells you the impact of a story like that. And they were so right. I've heard this statement over and over and over again, and I love it so much because it's so true that you can give people any amount of monetary things that you want to give them, and they won't remember you. But the one thing they will never forget about you is the way you make them feel. And for me, that's something that my parents taught me and taught me well. And I try to live by that, every single day, because the God that I believe in teaches that that's all that matters is what do you give back in your life to those around you, because it's the giving that matters. It's the part of life that makes life worth living, not the taking, but the giving.
Yeah, I mean, it's really the things that come from here, that matter
Absolutely.
most. And
Absolutely.
not one bit of material things can ever replace the feeling of being there for someone who needs it the most.
Absolutely. So true, Stanley. So true.
Well, this has been wonderful getting the chance to speak with you. I want to say thank you for coming on to Wrestling with Heart. It means a lot to me and to my listeners and viewers that are watching this on YouTube. Where can people find out more about you? If you have anything you want to plug or on any social media, please feel free and plug away.
So right now, I'm getting ready. I'm kind of social media illiterate. That's about to change though, because like I said, like I said earlier, I shot a motion picture behind the scenes of the wrestling business 30 years ago. And I have a feeling that if things continue down the road, they're continuing in the very near future, this movie's going to come out. The best way you can check me out, there will always be links where you can write to me. It's called The Pain Lair, all one word. That's my YouTube channel, PAYNELAIR, The Pain Lair. That's the best place right now to get a hold of me. Daryl Peterson is my tag at YouTube. I will eventually, in the very near future, have my Maxx Payne YouTube or Facebook channel up, and I hope to get I will not I hope to I will get my Instagram rocking and rolling, and so hopefully in the very near future, within the next 6 months or so, I will have all of those up and going. But the best place for right now, and there's a bunch of videos that people might enjoy at the Payne Lair on YouTube.
All right. Well, thanks so much. I'm looking forward to checking those out, and I'd love to have you back on. We'll do a part 2 in the near future.
Sounds great, Stan. I look forward to it. Thanks for your time.
Absolutely. Take care. This is Wrestling with Heart. I hope you found this podcast to be informative and entertaining. If you did, please hit the subscribe button and look out for the next edition.